Imagine this for a moment. North America, centuries before Columbus ever set sail. Towering cities rise along the rivers, bustling with tens of thousands of people. Farmers cultivate fields that stretch as far as the eye can see. Astronomers stand under the night sky, mapping the stars with uncanny precision. And doctors, yes, doctors, are already creating medicines that the world wouldn't stumble upon for hundreds of years. This was not an empty wilderness. It was a world alive with genius. And yet, when many of us were children, the picture we were given looked nothing like this. The stories in textbooks and on television flattened centuries of rich history into a single cartoon. Men on horseback yelling war cries, feathered headdresses fluttering in the wind, and endless tipis scattered across the plains. It made for dramatic movie scenes, yes, but it left the truth buried deeper than an arrowhead in the soil. Stick around to the end to discover the reality that Hollywood never wanted you to see. The truth is far more astonishing, and if we're being honest, far more interesting. The great city of Cahokia, for example, near modern St. Louis, was said to be larger than London around the year 1100. Can you imagine that? While Europe was grappling with feudal castles and famines, North America had a thriving metropolis with monumental earthen mounds, plazas, and trade networks stretching across a continent. But chances are you didn't hear a word about it in school. And here's where a little humor sneaks in. We've been sold a Hollywood version of Native Americans so persistent that, for some, it's hard to picture anything else. It's as if someone tried to explain all of Europe by showing only Monty Python's peasants. Entertaining, yes. Accurate? Not even close. What was lost in those old portrayals is the sheer variety. There were farmers of the Southwest, sailors on the Pacific, hunters in the plains, and philosophers who debated governance long before modern democracies took shape. Each group had its own ways of living, believing, and surviving, and to squeeze all of that into one stereotype is like trying to summarize an opera with a single drumbeat. So when we say everything you thought you knew is wrong, it isn't meant as scolding. It's an invitation to step past the myths, to dust off the forgotten truths, and to see a world that was vibrant, intelligent, and very much alive. And here's the real twist. Those lessons aren't just history. Many of them still matter today. Stick around, because what you're about to see isn't just a correction of the past. It explains how those old stereotypes shaped laws, schools, and even nations. This isn't just about tidying up the history books. The way Native Americans were misrepresented didn't stop at the classroom door. It shaped policies, courtrooms, and even international treaties. Entire nations operated on the belief that indigenous people were somehow less advanced, and from that shaky foundation came laws that stripped them of land, languages, and rights. A stereotype, in other words, was not just a picture on a movie screen. It became the excuse for generations of injustice. And here's the tragedy within the tragedy. By clinging to these old, worn-out images, we overlook something priceless. We miss the systems of survival that kept entire populations thriving in landscapes where Europeans would have starved. We ignore centuries of ecological knowledge, forest management practices, sustainable farming, and water conservation that today's scientists are scrambling to rediscover. And we forget cultural legacies, stories, philosophies, and systems of governance that influence democratic ideals and still have something to teach us. Think about it this way. When we cling to myths, we end up with less knowledge than our ancestors had. It's like owning a library, but only ever reading the comic strip section. Entertaining, sure, but you miss the great volumes of wisdom sitting right there on the shelf. The irony is that these legacies were never lost. They were silenced, written over by the loud voices of conquest and cinema. Yet they remain, carried in oral traditions, preserved in ceremonies, and now, increasingly, confirmed by archaeology and modern science. For example, indigenous fire management techniques are being studied as solutions to devastating wildfires in California and Australia. Agricultural methods that preserved soil fertility for centuries are being re-examined in a world worried about climate change. The genius is still here. It always was. To ignore this is not only a mistake, it's an expensive one. We live in a century where food security, environmental collapse, and cultural division dominate the headlines. The answers won't come from repeating old errors or dusting off stereotypes that never fit to begin with. They may very well come from the very people we were taught to dismiss. So yes, believing the myths means overlooking the genius. And at this stage in history, overlooking genius isn't just careless. It's something we can no longer afford. If you think that genius was rare, wait until you see what North America really looked like 500 years ago. 500 years ago, North America was anything but an empty wilderness. It was alive with civilizations as varied and complex as those in Europe. Along the great rivers, farmers cultivated maize in fields that stretched for miles, using irrigation techniques that turned dry land fertile. In the icy north, hunters mastered the frozen tundra with tools and clothing so well designed that modern engineers still study them. On the coasts, sailors set out across open oceans in vessels sleek enough to rival anything carved in the shipyards of Spain. And under the star-filled skies, astronomers tracked the heavens with a precision that guided harvests and ceremonies alike. In short, this was not a scattered handful of tribes. It was a continent brimming with ingenuity, each region with its own way of thriving. Some built monuments that dwarfed the landscapes around them, massive earthen mounds rising like cathedrals of soil, aligned with the movements of the sun and moon. Others wove philosophies of governance and community that would later inspire democratic ideals. Far from primitive, these were societies that understood balance, survival, and beauty in equal measure. So how did we end up with one tired picture? Buffalo hunters circling tipis on horseback. The short answer? Convenience. Colonial powers found it easier to dismiss indigenous nations as simple than to admit they were negotiating with equals. Later, Hollywood doubled down, reducing centuries of diversity to a single costume: feathers, tomahawks, and war cries. Schoolbooks followed suit, flattening vibrant civilizations into stereotypes fit for a single page. But history has a stubborn way of surviving. It lingers in stone ruins, in patterns cut into the soil, in stories passed from elder to child. And if we look closely, we'll see that the real North America never disappeared. It's been here all along, waiting for us to notice. And the first clue is hidden in a place few of us were ever taught about: a forgotten city that rewrites everything we thought we knew. We have often been told that Native Americans lived in scattered bands, surviving hand to mouth in a wilderness that seemed too vast and harsh. Beneath the soil lie the remnants of cities and civilizations that rivaled those of Europe. Consider Cahokia, just outside present-day St. Louis. Around the year 1100, it was not merely a settlement, but the largest city north of Mexico, and astonishingly, it was larger than London at the very same time. Imagine that comparison for a moment. While Europe wrestled with famine, plagues, and the iron grip of feudal lords, the Mississippi Valley nurtured a thriving metropolis of perhaps 40,000 people. At the city's heart rose Monk's Mound, a monumental structure built entirely by hand with packed earth. The volume of soil moved to create it exceeds that of the Great Pyramid of Giza, a staggering achievement that required vision, labor, and organized leadership. This was no scattered campfire existence. This was urban life. Trade routes radiated outward like spokes on a wheel. Copper from the Great Lakes gleamed in ornamental pieces. Shells from the Gulf Coast were carved into delicate jewelry, and obsidian from the Rocky Mountains was napped into blades sharp enough to rival modern surgical steel. Goods moved across hundreds of miles, evidence of a continent linked by exchange, diplomacy, and shared knowledge. And yet here lies the strange part: most schoolbooks remain silent. A city that flourished for centuries is written out of the story, as if acknowledging it would break the carefully crafted image of native people as too simple for civilization. By ignoring Cahokia, a myth could be preserved. By recognizing it, that myth collapses. To downplay Cahokia is a little like finding Rome beneath your backyard and insisting it was just a vegetable patch. When we allow ourselves to look honestly, we see that Native America was never primitive. It was organized, complex, and brilliant. A civilization in every sense of the word. Stick around because their genius went beyond building cities. It reached into science, survival, and medicine in ways that will surprise you. Imagine standing on the edge of an icy sea, the horizon a blur of fog and freezing waves. Most of us, even with modern gear, would hesitate to take a single step forward. No compass, no radar, no GPS, no Coast Guard to call if things went wrong. Yet for the Inuit, such journeys were routine. Their solution was not luck or blind courage, but engineering. The Inuit kayak was a marvel of design. Built from driftwood frames covered with animal skins, every curve served a purpose. It was balanced so precisely that it could slice through waves silently, track straight even in rough water, and, most importantly, be righted if it capsized. These were not crude rafts. They were precision instruments born of centuries of trial and refinement. Modern engineers still marvel at the design, borrowing elements for everything from Olympic racing kayaks to military watercraft. Imagine that, an indigenous technology, perfected long before Europeans could match it, still influencing modern designs today. Further south, another invention reshaped travel and trade: the birchbark canoe. If the kayak was the sports car of the Arctic, the canoe was the pickup truck of the woodlands. Lightweight, strong, and flexible, it could carry hundreds of pounds of goods across rivers and lakes, yet one person could hoist it onto their shoulders for a portage. Traders moved copper, furs, food, and tools across entire regions with these vessels. When Europeans arrived, they quickly abandoned their own heavy, clumsy boats and adopted the birchbark canoe. Sometimes the smartest thing a newcomer can do is put pride aside and learn from those who already know the waters. medicine tells the same story of brilliance. Across the continent, native nations developed remedies that came not from superstition, but from generations of careful observation and experimentation. Willow bark, for example, was used to relieve pain. Today we know it contains salicylic acid, the foundation of aspirin. Broken bones were immobilized with wooden splints, wounds stitched with animal sinew, fevers treated with plants that modern laboratories now confirm have antimicrobial or anti-inflammatory properties. These treatments were not accidents. They were part of a sophisticated body of knowledge about the human body and the natural world. In some cases, native medicine was not only equal to European practice, it was centuries ahead. While doctors in Europe were still bleeding patients with leeches, indigenous healers were using botanical compounds that we now produce in pharmaceutical factories. It is worth noting, of course, that not every cure worked perfectly, but that is true of any medical system, even today. The difference is that theirs was based on a deep and respectful relationship with nature. The word primitive crumbles when faced with such evidence. These were not people fumbling in the dark. They were scientists, engineers, and doctors, solving problems with tools crafted from the resources at hand, and doing so with remarkable success. Their technologies may have looked different from ours, but the thinking behind them was sophisticated, precise, and, when measured by effectiveness, astonishingly modern. Stick around, because the real surprise is this. There wasn't just one native culture, but hundreds, as different from each other as Vikings were from Venetians. To say Native American as if it described one single culture is a little like saying everyone in Europe is simply a European. Take the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest. In the blistering desert heat, they built multi-story adobe cities that still stand today, their walls glowing gold in the sun. These were not just houses, but entire communities with plazas, storage rooms, and ceremonial spaces woven into the architecture. Water was scarce, yet through irrigation canals and careful planning they created a sustainable way of life that endured for centuries. Far to the northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy organized themselves under what became one of the world's oldest participatory democracies. Several nations joined together, agreeing on laws and councils, balancing individual rights with communal responsibility. Centuries later, their model would influence the framers of the United States Constitution. In other words, democracy on this continent was not imported wholesale from Europe. It already had deep indigenous roots. On the Pacific Northwest coast, towering cedar longhouses sheltered extended families, while carved totem poles told stories of lineage, history, and belief. These were not decorations, but libraries in wood, records carved into living trees that could stand for generations. Feasts and potlatches reinforced social bonds. And on the Great Plains, buffalo hunting was far more than a way to fill the cooking pot. It was ceremony, survival, and spiritual rhythm tied to the earth itself. Every part of the animal was used: meat, hide, bone, sinew, nothing wasted. To participate in the hunt was to step into a cycle of respect between people and nature. Each nation had its own languages, foods, music, and worldview. To blur them all into one Hollywood figure, leather fringes, feathers, and a war cry, does a disservice not only to history, but to the sheer creativity of human culture. The truth is richer, more varied, and far more interesting than the stereotype we were handed. Stick around, because even the image of the fearless warrior is more myth than fact, and the reality will surprise you. Hollywood loved its screaming warriors, faces streaked with paint, charging recklessly into battle. It made for thrilling cinema, but the reality was far more complex and far more human. Real native warfare was shaped by culture, rules, and sometimes even mercy, which is not something you often find in the battlefields of history. Many nations had established codes of conduct that governed when, how, and against whom violence could be used. Among the Lakota, for example, warriors sometimes practiced what was called counting coup. Instead of striking down an enemy, the bravest act was to ride close enough to touch him with a hand or a stick, and then escape unharmed. Imagine the nerve it took to pull that off. It was less about killing and more about courage. The Iroquois, meanwhile, were as skilled in diplomacy as in battle. Conflicts could be addressed in councils that stretched for days, with speeches, negotiation, and careful decision-making. These gatherings often involved elaborate rituals designed to cool tempers and restore balance. War was not the first option, nor the most admired outcome. It was one tool among many in the pursuit of stability. Contrast this with European warfare of the same era. In the 16th and 17th centuries, armies routinely burned villages, slaughtered civilians, and salted fields to ensure famine. The idea of bravery was often measured by how thoroughly one could devastate the enemy. By comparison, many native practices appeared not primitive, but surprisingly restrained. Of course, battles could still be brutal. War parties raided for resources, captives, or retribution, yet these actions were carried out within frameworks of custom and meaning, not the chaotic violence of the movie screen. The difference is important. It reminds us that native warriors were not faceless hordes, but individuals operating within societies that valued courage, respect, and sometimes restraint. So when we strip away the Hollywood mask, the old stereotype collapses. What remains is a portrait of warfare that was sophisticated, bound by honor, and deeply tied to cultural values. It was not the endless savagery we were shown in black and white westerns, but a human struggle with rules, risks, and choices. Wait till you see what comes next, because the greatest battle was not fought with weapons at all, but with survival itself, as native identity faced centuries of attempts to erase it. Lands were seized through broken treaties, children taken from their families and forced into boarding schools, languages forbidden in classrooms, and sacred ceremonies outlawed by governments that claimed to know better. The idea was simple in its cruelty. If you cut a people off from their land, their language, and their ways of life, eventually the culture itself would vanish. But here's the twist. It never worked. The heartbeat never stopped. Across North America, native languages are being spoken again, taught in schools, recorded in dictionaries, and passed from grandparents to grandchildren. A tongue once whispered in secret can now be heard proudly in classrooms and public gatherings. Each word spoken is a small act of defiance, and at the same time, a thread connecting the present to centuries past. Powwows bring communities together, filling fields and arenas with the deep thrum of drums, the swirl of regalia, and the cadence of songs carried through generations. These gatherings are not just festivals. They are living affirmations that culture cannot be legislated out of existence. When a drumbeat rises and the dancers move, it is history, resistance, and joy woven together. Traditional foods and medicines are also finding their way back into kitchens and clinics. Corn, beans, squash, and wild rice remain staples not just of diet, but of identity. Herbal remedies once dismissed as superstition are now recognized by modern science for their healing properties. To cook, to plant, to heal in the old ways is to reclaim both health and heritage. Most powerful of all, indigenous voices are telling their own stories again. Writers, filmmakers, artists, and elders are speaking into the silence left by centuries of suppression. Where once history was written by outsiders, today native people are writing it themselves, reshaping the narrative for future generations. So let's set the record straight. Native Americans weren't relics of the past. They were city builders, scientists, philosophers, and survivors whose legacies still shape us today. The myths are easy. The truth? Far more extraordinary, because history isn't just something to remember, it's something to relearn before we forget the answers we still need. Which of these surprised you most? The lost cities? The science? Or the survival skills? And if you could bring one native tradition into modern life, which would it be? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe, so let's keep rewriting history together.